Karoline Light walked onto the HBO studio stage with evidence nobody expected she had. What happened in the next 30 seconds left Bill Maher completely speechless and may change how political talk shows operate forever. Nobody thought this interview would be anything special that evening. The show was following its usual format, Bill Maher with his signature smirk. The studio audience primed for his sharp wit, cameras positioned for maximum impact. The stage glowed under the bright lights. Audience falling silent as Bill Maher stood center stage. Blue suit impeccably tailored, his gaze analytical and prepared as always. The camera panned slowly, scattered applause rising as the show's announcer introduced. And now, please welcome White House Press Secretary Karoline Light. She walked confidently across the stage, her navy blazer crisp against a white blouse, blonde hair neatly styled. The applause was polite, but restrained. This was Maher's territory after all, and the predominantly progressive audience viewed her as an adversary, the voice of an administration they opposed. "Thanks for joining us," Maher said, leaning back, in his chair with practiced ease. "I know you've had a busy week defending the indefensible." The audience chuckled on cue, but Leavitt didn't flinch. She settled into her chair, smiled briefly, and then reached into a slim leather portfolio. "Actually, Bill, before we start, I'd like to address something you said at your rally with Pam Bondi last weekend." Maher's eyebrow raised slightly, that familiar smirk beginning to form. "Oh, you want to talk about that?" "Good. But he never finished his sentence, because what Leavitt pulled out next silenced not just Maher, but the entire studio. If you're seeing this showdown for the first time, make sure to like and subscribe so you won't miss our analysis of how this political confrontation transforms the media landscape. For months, Bill Maher had been positioning himself as a political centrist, someone who could criticize both sides equally. On his show, Real Time, he frequently claimed he was simply interested in honest debate and hadn't picked sides in America's increasingly polarized landscape. His growing popularity among moderates came from this perception that he was one of the few voices in media willing to call out extremism regardless of political affiliation. Last weekend, however, he appeared at a rally with former attorney General Pam Bondi, where he delivered what he called a nonpartisan critique of the EAT current administration. Media covered it extensively, with most outlets praising Maher for speaking truth to power, regardless of his own political leanings. But Karoline Leavitt, the youngest White House press secretary in American history at just 27, had been carefully watching. Sharp, quick-witted, and meticulously prepared, she had risen rapidly through political communications ranks despite her youth. Critics dismissed her as inexperienced, a Gen Z puppet reading talking points. What they missed was her remarkable ability to analyze media narratives and identify inconsistencies that others overlooked. As Maher's audience settled in for what they expected would be another masterclass in the host, putting a young conservative on the defensive, Leavitt had other plans. The stakes couldn't have been higher, not just for her credibility as press secretary, but for the public's understanding of how media figures frame political narratives while claiming objectivity. "You've built your entire brand lately on being a political centrist," Leavitt began, her voice calm but firm. "Someone who criticizes both sides equally, who hasn't picked a team." She placed a folder on the table between them. "But that's not quite accurate, is it, Bill?" Maher leaned forward, confident but slightly wary. "I call it like I see it. Sometimes that means criticizing the left, sometimes the right. And at the Bondi rally, you said specifically, and I quote, 'I'm just a comedian looking for the truth, not pushing anyone's agenda.'" Leavitt maintained eye contact, her expression serious. "That's your public position, correct?" "Yes, absolutely," Maher replied, glancing at the folder. "What's your point?" Leavitt opened the folder deliberately. "My point is that private communications tell a very different story," the audience murmured. This wasn't the defensive talking points exchange they had anticipated. Something was shifting in the studio's atmosphere. Maher's producer, visible in the wings, took a step closer to the stage, suddenly attentive. "What exactly are you implying?" Maher asked, his trademark smirk fading slightly. "I'm not implying anything," Leavitt replied. "I'm about to show evidence." As Leavitt began presenting her evidence, something unexpected happened. Maher's producers tried interrupting, with one approaching the stage as if to suggest a commercial break. The floor director made a cutting motion across his throat, the universal signal to stop filming. But Maher, perhaps understanding that stopping now would look worse, waved them off. "Let's hear what she has," he said, a forced casualness in his voice. The tension in the studio was electric as cameras continued rolling. Leavitt pulled out the eToy first document, a printed email with certain sections highlighted in yellow. "This is an email sent from your personal account to Pam Bondi 3 weeks before your rally appearance," she said, sliding it across the table. "You state," and I quote, "We need to coordinate our messaging to maximize impact against the administration. My team will work with yours on specific talking points." The audience stirred. This didn't sound like the words of a neutral comedian, just seeking truth. Maher glanced at the paper, his expression tightening slightly. Context matters. This was about aligning on facts, not politics. "Let's look at more context then," Leavitt said, unruffled. She pulled out a second document. "This is a text exchange between you and Miss Bondi from 2 days before the rally." She placed it beside the first. "Paper, here you write, 'The key is maintaining my public neutrality while helping push the narrative. My audience trusts me precisely because they think I'm not on a team.'" A murmur rippled through the audience. Someone gasped audibly. Maher's face flushed slightly. "Where did you get these?" he asked, voice lower but microphone still catching every word. "That's not the question you should be asking," Leavitt replied calmly. "The question is, are they authentic?" Maher looked down at the documents, then back up at Leavitt. For perhaps the first time in his career, he seemed momentarily at a loss for words. The audience, sensing blood in the water, was completely silent. "Now, these are private communications taken out of context," he finally said, recovering some composure, "and possibly obtained illegally." "They're not illegally obtained," Leavitt said, "and they're not out of context when I have the complete exchanges right here." She tapped the folder. "Including your detailed strategy for maintaining a public image of neutrality while privately working to undermine the administration." Maher's eyes darkened. "This is a hit job. You've come on my show with selectively edited materials to create a false narrative." "Nothing is edited," Leavitt countered, maintaining her calm demeanor. "But let's move to something that can't be edited. Video." She nodded to someone off stage, and the large screen behind them lit up. It showed Bill Maher in what appeared to be a private meeting room with Pam Bondi and several staffers. The timestamp in the corner showed it was recorded 3 days before the rally. "I'm playing the both sides card publicly," Video Maher said clearly, "because that's how I maintain credibility with my audience. But between us, we know which side needs to win in November." The studio audience gasped collectively. Maher stared at the screen, visibly stunned. "Turn that off," he said sharply, looking toward his production team, but no one moved. "Leavitt, let the video continue for another 10 seconds before signaling for it to stop. There's more, but I think that makes the point clear." In the control room, producers were frantically conversing. This was live television. They couldn't edit it, couldn't stop it without making the situation worse. What had been planned as a routine political interview had transformed into something far more explosive. Maher took a deep breath, visibly collecting himself. "You've brought these selective snippets to my show without giving me any opportunity to prepare a response. That's not fair journalism." "With respect, Bill," Leavitt replied, "I'm not a journalist. I'm the White House press secretary responding to your public claims of neutrality, and nothing here is selective. I'm happy to release the full communications and unedited video." The audience, usually firmly in Maher's corner, was shifting uncomfortably in their seats. This wasn't the entertainment they'd expected. This was something raw and uncomfortable, the unmasking of carefully constructed political theater. "Do you deny saying these things?" Leavitt pressed, when Maher didn't immediately respond. "We need to take a break," Maher said finally, looking directly at the cameras. But before the director could cut to commercial, Leavitt interjected. "Your audience deserves to hear your answer first," she said. "Do you deny coordinating political messaging while publicly claiming neutrality?" It was the moment that would be replayed millions of times in the coming days. Bill Maher, the quick-witted host who always had a comeback, sitting in stunned silence for what felt like an eternity, but was actually about 5 seconds of dead air. Live television has no mercy for such moments. "I have conversations with many people," he finally said, his voice tight. "Bondi and I discussed how to frame certain issues. Yes, that doesn't mean I've abandoned my independent thinking." Leavitt nodded slightly. "So you acknowledge the communications are authentic?" Maher's jaw tightened visibly. "Some appear to be. Yes, though without reviewing everything you've brought. I can't verify all of it. But private conversations. Private. Conversations that directly contradict your public statements." Leavitt finished for him. "You told your audience you were neutral. You told rally attendees you weren't pushing anyone's agenda. Yet behind closed doors, you were explicitly coordinating messaging to target the administration while deliberately maintaining an image of neutrality to keep your audience's trust." The audience was completely silent now. Even Maher's most loyal supporters couldn't square what they just seen with the host's carefully cultivated image. "This is precisely the kind of media manipulation Americans are tired of," Leavitt continued, her voice level but firm, claiming to be an honest broker while secretly working to advance specific political narratives. Maher leaned forward suddenly. "Let's be clear here. You work for an administration that has its own issues with truth and transparency. This ambush interview is not an ambush," Leavitt cut in. "It's accountability, the same kind you claim to stand for." She turned slightly toward the audience. "Bill built his brand on calling out hypocrisy. That's exactly what I'm doing tonight." The camera caught Maher's expression, a mixture of anger and a dawning realization that he had severely underestimated the young press secretary sitting across from him. He had expected talking points and defensive responses. Instead, he was facing meticulously gathered evidence and a composed opponent who refused to be rattled. "Where did you get this material?" he asked again, his tone now serious. "From concerned citizens who believed Americans deserved to know the truth," Leavitt answered. "People who had access to these communications and were troubled by the discrepancy between your public and private positions." She reached into her folder one last time and pulled out what appeared to be contract. "This is perhaps most troubling. Of all, a consulting agreement between your production company and a political action committee associated with Ms. Bondi's advocacy group. It details a 6F-figure payment for strategic communication services beginning 3 months ago." The audience audibly reacted. Maher's producer stepped onto the stage now, whispering urgently in his ear. Maher listened, nodded once, then turned back to the cameras. "We're going to take a break now," he said firmly. "When we come back, we'll continue this conversation." But as the show went to commercial, the damage was done. In the studio, audience members were already on their phones posting about what they'd witnessed. Production assistants huddled near the stage, some looking at Leavitt with a mixture of shock and something approaching respect. Maher remained in his chair, conferring intensely with his executive producer. Leavitt sat calmly, rearranging her documents. She had not raised her voice once. She hadn't needed to. The evidence spoke for itself. When the cameras returned, Maher had regained some composure. "Welcome back to real time," he said. "Before the break, we were discussing some communications that Ms. Leavitt brought to the show. I want to be clear that while I stand by my independence as a commentator, I acknowledge that some of these exchanges could be interpreted as inconsistent with my public statements. It wasn't quite an admission, but it was as close as he could, come without completely surrendering. The audience, usually so supportive, remained conspicuously quiet. "What the American people want is simple honesty," Leavitt responded. "Not claiming neutrality while secretly working to advance partisan goals. Not building trust with viewers only to use that trust to push undisclosed agendas. And your administration is a paragon of transparency," Maher countered, trying to regain footing. "We make no claims of neutrality," Leavitt replied immediately. "The American people elected us knowing exactly where we stand. We're straightforward about our positions and goals. We don't pretend to be something we're not." It was a devastating point that left Maher without an effective response. The fundamental charge wasn't about political positions. It was about honesty regarding those positions. And on that battleground, the evidence had fatally undermined his defense. As the segment concluded, Maher attempted to salvage something with his closing remarks. "Well, this has certainly been illuminating. I appreciate you bringing these concerns forward, and I'm sure my team will be reviewing the materials thoroughly." Leavitt nodded, maintaining the composed demeanor she had shown throughout. "Thank you for having me, Bill. I think your audience deserves a more complete explanation than that, but I appreciate the platform to share this information." And with that, the most unexpected political confrontation of the year came to its conclusion. Not with shouting or theatrics, but with the quiet devastation of exposed contradiction. Within minutes of the broadcast ending, clips from the confrontation exploded across social media. Maher exposed and Leavitt receipts became the top trending hashtags nationwide. The moment when Maher sat in stunned silence after being presented, with the video was turned into GIFs and memes that spread like wildfire. One viral tweet simply read, "Karoline Leavitt just ended a career that was built on calling out exactly what she caught him doing. Major news networks interrupted their regular programming to cover what had happened. CNN ran with Maher court." In contradiction, press secretary reveals private dealings. Fox News went with Leavitt, exposes Maher's neutrality claim with damning evidence. MSNBC somewhat defensively framed it as, "Leavitt ambushes Maher with alleged private communications." The clip of Maher saying, "I'm playing the both sides card publicly because that's how I maintain credibility," was replayed continuously across all platforms. Media critics and political analysts were called in to provide instant reaction, many noting that regardless of political affiliation, the contradiction between public and private positioning struck at the heart of media trust issues. By midnight, over 20 million people had watched clips of the confrontation. YouTube comment sections filled with variations of, "I've watched Maher for years and never expected this." And no matter your politics, this kind of deception is exactly what's wrong with media. HBO executives called an emergency meeting. Maher's production team huddled in crisis mode. Public relations firms representing both Ma and Pam Bandy began declining all comment requests, stating only that they were reviewing the situation. The next morning, the story dominated every major newspaper. The New York Times ran with Maher's "Mask Slips, White House Press, Secretary Reveals Contradiction." The Washington Post published analysis, "How Leavitt's Methodical Exposure Changes Political Media Dynamics." Even entertainment publications like Variety led with industry shockwaves as Maher's neutrality claim crumbles on own show. At the White House briefing that day, the room was packed beyond capacity. Reporters who normally covered only hard news were suddenly interested in what the young press secretary had to say. Leavitt approached the podium with the same calm composure she had shown on Maher's program. "Before we begin today's briefing, I'd like to address what happened last night," she said. "I did not go on that program intending to create a spectacle. I went prepared to correct a public misrepresentation that was undermining honest political discourse. Americans deserve media figures who are transparent about their motivations and alignments. When asked how she obtained the materials, Leavitt was direct. Multiple concerned citizens with legal access to these communications brought them forward because they were troubled by the discrepancy between public claims and private actions. All materials were vetted for authenticity before I presented them. The political implications extended far beyond one talk show host. Questions were now being raised about other media figures who claimed neutrality while potentially harboring undisclosed agendas. Several prominent commentators hastily issued statements reaffirming their independence. Media ethics experts were suddenly in high demand for interviews and panel discussions. Pam Bondi initially declined all comment requests, but as pressure mounted, her office released a brief statement. Attorney General Bondi engaged with Mr. Maher as she would with any media figure interested in policy discussions. Any characterization of these interactions as improper coordination is mistaken. But the consulting contract Leavitt had revealed proved difficult to explain away. By mid-week, financial records confirmed that Maher's production company had indeed received payments matching the document Leavitt had shown on air. 3 days after the confrontation, Maher finally issued a statement on social media. For years, I've prided myself on speaking truth to power and calling out hypocrisy wherever I see it. Last week, I fell short of my own standards. While some of the materials presented on my show were lacking context, I acknowledge that my private communications did not fully align with my public positioning. For that inconsistency, I apologize to my viewers who have trusted me to be straightforward with them. I will be taking time to reflect on how I can better live up to the principles I've championed. HBO announced that Real Time would go on a brief hiatus while the network and Maher evaluate next steps. Industry insiders reported that several advertisers had already pulled out of the program. Meanwhile, Karoline Leavitt's public profile transformed overnight. Once dismissed by many as too young and inexperienced for her role, she was now being described with terms like strategic, composed, and formidable. Senior administration officials who had initially been skeptical of her appointment expressed new appreciation for her capabilities. Media training firms began using clips from the confrontation in their courses, analyzing how Leavitt maintained control through preparation, evidence, and calm persistence. Political communication students were assigned to study the exchange as a masterclass in handling hostile media environments. Beyond the immediate fallout for the individuals involved, the incident sparked a broader national conversation about media transparency. Several legislators proposed new requirements for commentators to disclose financial relationships with political organizations. Media watchdog groups called for industry-wide standards on disclosure of political alignments and financial interests. 2 weeks after the confrontation, polling showed an interesting shift. Americans across the political spectrum expressed increased skepticism about media figures who claimed neutrality. One respondent's comment captured the prevailing sentiment. I'd rather hear from someone honest about their bias than someone pretending not to have one. For Leavitt, the long-term impact was substantial. What could have been a routine, forgettable interview became a defining moment that established her as someone who didn't just deflect or spin. She came prepared to substantively engage, and when necessary to hold others accountable with evidence rather than rhetoric. 6 months later, a media ethics professor at Columbia summarized the incident's significance in an academic paper. The Leavitt Maher confrontation represented a rare moment of genuine accountability in an era of carefully controlled media narratives. Its lasting impact lies not in the embarrassment of one commentator, but in how it forced audiences to question the gap between public positioning and private action among those who shape our national conversation. In Washington, where reputations can be made or broken in a single news cycle, Karoline Leavitt had done something remarkable. She had changed the rules of engagement not through outrage or theatrics, but through meticulous preparation and a commitment to evidence over assertion. The incident became known simply as the receipts, a shorthand reference to how preparation and evidence could trump reputation and experience. In political communication circles, a new phrase entered the lexicon. Don't get Leavitted, meaning don't get caught contradicting your public claims with private actions. The legacy of that confrontation wasn't just about one media figure's damaged credibility or one press secretary's enhanced reputation. It was about the enduring power of documented truth in an era often defined by competing narratives rather than verifiable facts. It reminded audiences and media figures alike that, in the end, no amount of charm, wit, or performance could withstand the simple power of evidence that exposed a fundamental contradiction. So if this story made you think about media transparency, about the gap between public personas and private actions, about how young voices can challenge established figures when armed with facts instead of just opinions, subscribe to this channel. The political landscape is constantly evolving, and we'll be here to break down the moments that matter, the confrontations that change the game, and the emerging voices reshaping how political communication works in America today. Because as Karoline Light showed Bill Maher that night, authenticity isn't just a buzzword. It's the currency that truly matters in our national conversation.